Greetings, young scientists. If you remember where we last left off, we were talking about the difference between variations, which is just a difference in a population, and adaptations, which is a difference in a population that helps an organism better survive and reproduce. So we're going to take a little deeper dive into the types of adaptations that animals can have to help them better survive in whatever particular habitat that they're living in. So if you look at this slide here, you can see that there's three different types of adaptations that animals can have to help them better survive and reproduce. One is called a structural adaptation. That's where a structure on the outside of the body, you could think like a shark's fins, or you could think about like an opposable thumb on a human. On the outside of the body, we call that a structural adaptation. If there is something that is produced inside the body, we call that a physiological adaptation. A classic example of that is going to be the poison venom in a snake. You could also think about the stomach acid that we produce to help us break down food so that we can utilize the glucose for energy. And then you can also have a behavioral adaptation, and that's where an organism's behavior allows it to better survive and reproduce. And I believe the classic one is fish swimming in schools. This is a behavior. It allows them to better elude predators so that the fish do not get eaten by a larger fish in the ocean or in a pond or in a creek or something like that. So schooling fish is also a classic example of that. If you want to look at the African Serengeti, you can look at wildebeest that school up, and these herds migrate following essentially the rain patterns across the African Serengeti in Kenya and Uganda. So when you have the accumulation of these adaptations, eventually over time we get organisms that were once similar to one another slowly becoming more different from one another over time. Eventually, these organisms become so different from one another that two organisms that were once of the same species split off and they become two different species. The classic example of this is there was one species of finch that flew over from South America. It landed on the Galapagos Islands, and that evolved into 13 different species of finch. The question lots of students ask is, well, how do you know the difference between one species and another species? How do we know that these are different enough so that we actually classify them as two different species? Well, there is a scientific answer for that, and the answer is we call an organism or organisms the same species if they can reproduce and they can have fertile offspring, and that means that they can have babies that when they grow up, they can have babies of their own. Now, sometimes you can get organisms that are so closely related that they can still mate together and they can still have babies, but the babies themselves are not fertile. You may have heard of the example before. These are called hybrids. You may have heard of the example before of a liger. That is a lion that can actually mate with a tiger. These are two separate species because the liger, although it is a living thing, a real thing, a liger cannot have babies of its own. It is sterile. Another classic example are horses and donkeys. These are very closely related. They can actually have offspring. The offspring would be a mule, but the mule itself cannot have babies of its own. But if you look at something like a human male and human female, same species. They end up having a baby. That baby grows up and can have babies of its own. That's the example of being in the same species. So the three different types of adaptations that we can have structural adaptations, physiological adaptations, and we can also have behavioral adaptations. The way that we get those adaptations is again through the process of natural selection. And so when we look at natural selection, nature can select in a few different ways in order to allow an organism to better survive and reproduce. These three different types of natural selection, our first one is called directional selection. That's where a population shifts to one extreme form of a trait. Classic example of this would be the human brain. Over time, it has gotten larger and larger. Stabilizing selection is an interesting one. Stabilizing selection is when the middle form of a trait or an intermediate form is selected for. And at first when I heard this, I couldn't think of an example, but there is a classic example of stabilizing selection that has happened to all of us, and that is our birth weight. So if you think about this and you look at the data, if you are born and you are really, really big, Okay, you and the mother have less of a chance of survival. Now, out there right now, there's some student that's saying, well, Mr. Dell, I was born at 11 pounds. I was gigantic, and here I am. I'm still alive. I agree. But if you look at the data over large portions of the population, if you are really, really large in size at birth, you're not as likely to survive. Flip the coin then. If you were really, really small at the time of birth, okay, you also would have less likely of a chance to survive. Does that mean that you can't be alive if you were born at 3 pounds? No, of course you can. But over the course of we're looking at large populations, you are less likely to survive. What is the intermediate weight for humans? It's around 7 pounds. Mr. Dell came in at 7 pounds, 4 ounces, and here I am perfectly happy. The last one is called disruptive selection. This is where either extreme forms of a trait are going to be selected for, and the best way that I can describe that to you is when I show you the example, and I'll do that in just a second. Okay, here's two examples of directional selection. Cheetahs have gotten faster and lighter over time. It's going in one direction. Human brain has gotten larger over time. It's gone in one direction. Giraffes' necks have gotten longer over time. That type of natural selection has gone in one direction. I love the example of birth weight. Most human babies weigh in and around 7 pounds. Too big, you're less likely to make it. Too small, you're less likely to make it. So the middle trait is selected for. In disruptive selection, either extreme form of a trait is chosen for. So a classic example that I think about is African butterflies. They either appear as bright blue or bright orange. And the reason they appear as bright blue or bright orange is because they mimic other butterflies that are foul tasting. So if you're bright blue or bright orange, the predators tend to leave you alone. But if you're kind of in the middle, and let's say that you're a dull orange or a dull blue, well, you don't look like a foul-tasting butterfly, so predators are more likely to eat you. So what has nature selected then? It has selected either extreme form of the trait. I think the big pictures that you should be able to take out of this, you should know structural adaptations, behavioral adaptations, and physiological adaptations. You should also know the three different types of natural selection, which would be directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. And you should also know what the definition of a species is. So at this point, we've talked about natural selection, we've talked about the different types of adaptations, and then what we'll do in our next online segment, we'll take a look at how natural selection and adaptations drives different patterns of evolution. So until next time, we'll see you online, and I hope you were able to get something out of this little lecture. Thanks.